Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we have a special interview with a Sergeant Major from the US Army, showing his military experience, but also his love for Israel and the Jewish people. Today's guest is all the way from Vermont in the United States. His name is Warren Lyon, and he is a retired Sergeant Major in the US Army. Warren, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the Middle East Report. You can see that I'm in my home because of the COVID-19 restrictions, means that I have to record this program from my home here in the southeast of England. And there you are in Vermont in the United States. Just looking at your resume is incredibly impressive. But before we start talking about your military service and your background, let's start with how you came to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ.
First of all, thank you for having me on, Simon. I really appreciate it. I love your program. I'm very humbled because I've seen the guests you have on here, and it's quite impressive list of folks themselves and the subject matter. So thank you very much for having me on. The Lord Jesus Christ has been pivotal in my life since I was born. He's pivotal in all our lives, and we have to make a choice on what we do with that. But my mother was a believer. My father was not. And so I was raised with that dichotomy, not much emphasis on spiritual growth, etc. But when I was 12 years old, I actually saw the cross and the switchblade, David Wilkerson's story about Nicky Cruz and the Mau Mau's in New York City. And I went forward that night when I was 12, and I gave my life to Christ, Yeshua. I didn't know him as Yeshua. I knew him as Jesus Christ. And from that point on, it was a spiral. I didn't have the fatherly love example. I had a mother who would sneak me out to church, and a father who would pay church lip service, but he was a military guy and work driven. And, I quickly fell into rebellion as a youth, as my parents eventually got divorced when I was around 15. And, I have 4 sisters, and we grew up here in Vermont. And it's been an adventure with Christ ever since, trying to run from him, trying to make my own way and finding out the hard way that doesn't always end up very well.
Warren, can you share with us and with our viewers literally how the Lord dragged you from the streets and turned your life around? Because it's such a powerful testimony, and will give so much hope to so many of you, especially those who are really facing despair, particularly in this COVID-19 situation that we're all facing.
Right. Well, as a 16-year-old, I ran away from home, and I found nothing there for me, and I was so angry over the divorce or what have you. I was just an angry kid. And I took off. I quickly got involved in the most rebellious thing you can do in the 80s, and that was punk rock. Okay, it was right after your Sex Pistols had come over to United States and did their tours and things. I mean, a few years after that. But I got involved in following some bands around. It's kind of a violent lifestyle, kind of I don't care lifestyle, very anarchistic lifestyle. It was much like, I look at the rebels of today, and, it's all the same. There's nothing new under the sun. I don't believe we were quite as violent as groups today that fly an anarchist sign. They really want anarchy. And that's, something in our groups and in the bands, there were some serious guys, but it was really just rebellion against everything that authority stood for. It was about the music. You know, I got beat up by cops in New York City, Washington Square Park. I was sleeping on a bench, got a billy club in the ribs. Told to move along, you know, and I thought, wow, you know, I could probably do a better job than he does. I mean, I'm just a 16-year-old kid looking at it from outside of myself, and this kid, this police officer, just gave me a good jab and told me to move along for just trying to get some sleep. And you know, I can't point to that moment as being the moment that I decided I was going into law enforcement, but it was a pivotal moment. My friend had just got beat up and put in the hospital by another faction of punk rockers down in New York. And it was just chaos. And I knew I was either going to wind up in jail or addicted to drugs. And I knew there was something more, even still, something more in life.
So, share with us how you became, how you got involved in the U.S. Army, and what was it that made you think that you know, God's calling you to the U.S. military and have really an incredible, distinguished career serving and protecting the United States for almost over 32 years?
Yeah, I did go back to Vermont after, you know, a stint living in squat houses and things in New York City and in Boston. I went back to Vermont and finished high school, believe it or not. Actually got a diploma and didn't really know what to do with that. Drove a cab for a little while out of the airport. And, you know, I thought maybe the Army would give me a truck driver's license and I could drive truck. I didn't really have any plans for life at that point. And the recruiter showed me a film on being a military policeman. And that caught my eye. And so I did it. And within 3 years, I was in love with the military police corps. And, you know, the Army instilled in me something that was missing. Disciplined, but loving chain of command. I say loving, you know, in the way the Army would love you. As long as you do your job, they care for their people. Disciplined, structured environment where I could thrive. And I didn't have that before. Somebody to keep me in check, rules and regulations to keep me grounded. And so I started to grow as a young man in the first 3 years in the Army, but you know, I really faltered morally, really didn't have much direction other than becoming a soldier. Through a series of events in my life, in 1988, before I went to Germany, I rededicated my life to Christ in brokenness before him, and was baptized in Rehoboth, Maryland. And went to my first overseas assignment, which was Berlin, Germany.
In Berlin, in West Germany, just before the historical events of the fall of the Berlin Wall that effectively ended the Cold War that had been really established ever since the end of the Second World War between the United States and the Soviet Union.
It was surreal. Of course, I was 21 years old, and I had an opportunity to work quite a few shifts at Checkpoint Charlie, right in the center of Berlin, right at the gateway to the East Berlin sector, and you know, run by the Communist Party. And we would sit there. I remember one Christmas Eve being on duty. It seemed like I always got the holidays to work Checkpoint Charlie, but the snow was falling, and it was falling on the barbed wire, and you can see the tower across from us, and the East Germans were looking at us through their binoculars, and we were looking at them. And it was just a surreal, like, you're part of history right then. And that was 1988. And this was after Reagan had come and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And things started to happen quickly. Of course, in November of '89, the wall kind of broke down. And just the flood of people coming over, it was such a jubilant time. You know, you really thought the world could change. You know, it was, humanists were doing a lot of rejoicing back then because it seemed like mankind can come together and mankind can stop oppression and tear down these walls. And it was truly a miracle. a miracle of God that that wall came down.
Absolutely.
The party quickly went away a few weeks later, you know, as West Germany was just flooded, and Germany as a whole had some decisions to make about reunification and things like that. But it was a truly surreal time in my life.
And what was it like to be based in Germany, knowing that the United States has been involved in 2 world wars to help to liberate Europe? First of all, to liberate Europe from German imperialism during the First World War, and then to be on German soil, particularly after all those after the reign of the Nazis, of course, responsible for the death of over 6 million precious Jewish lives in the Holocaust. And then to know that you're on German soil wearing American uniform, that must have given you a few thoughts, didn't it?
Yeah. Well, like I said, the first year the wall was up, so I didn't leave Berlin a whole lot. In the third year I was there, we did get to go down south in Germany, cross some borders, and my first experience with seeing concentration camps, going to memorials and things like that about, um, the Holocaust, and again, more surrealism. Just amazing. I got married in that time frame. I had my son, and my daughter was on her way, and to be there amongst that kind of history was just, I don't know any other word other than surreal. And to walk through history, the Germans really appreciated us. They showed a lot of respect to the American soldiers. And as a military policeman, I was, exposed to the public quite a bit, and worked with the Polizei in Berlin. And there was a lot of respect. We were the occupying force until that wall fell. And so we governed under World War II rules and regulations. So it's the only place in the world up to 1989 that was still under an occupying force. But when the wall fell, the new world started popping forward. And what are we going to do with peace now? We had a whole generation of soldiers who were trained to fight the communists and in Russia and the Eastern Bloc countries. And now, glasnost and the fall of the Soviet Union, just everything started to change. The new generation of Germans didn't appreciate us being there quite so much. Things got to be a little more hostile. I left in 92, the end of 92, or 91, I'm sorry, and went back to the United States to be an instructor in the military police academy.
The story of what happened during the First Gulf War that first started in, I think, 2nd of August 1990, when Saddam invaded Kuwait, and then we saw the international coalition of forces gathering in the Middle East to actually remove Saddam and his 300,000 Iraqi troops that had occupied Kuwait until its liberation with Operation Desert Storm in January of 1991.
Yeah, up to that point, our army had not really been tested in all-out combat for a very long time. And I remember thinking, this is it. This is close to as close to Armageddon, or the trail to Armageddon, as we're getting. And we've been formed and trained for such a day as this. And of course, I had been assigned to the embassy in Berlin as embassy security, and we had a detachment there. And I had volunteered to go over when we started the invasion into Kuwait, taking back Kuwait. They had a special security clearance for us working at the embassy, and we got turned down, all the volunteers that wanted to go to the desert and confront Saddam Hussein's forces. But Berlin, we had our own challenges. Early in the conflict, when we were building up our forces in Kuwait, the German people were protesting our involvement and literally throwing pig's blood at the embassy and protesting every day. There was national days where they let the school children out of school to go protest against the United States involvement in Iraq. And then Saddam Hussein started throwing Scud missiles at Israel quite indiscriminately. And all the German people went home. It's amazing. They had no longer any purpose of protesting because of what they had been through and done, perpetrated, knowingly or unknowingly, to the Jewish people in the past. So they went home, and we didn't hear from them again. And there wasn't quite the threat to our embassy any longer. And pretty much the world fell in behind us in trying to get Saddam Hussein out of power.
And Warren, can you share with us when the Lord really placed a love for Israel and the Jewish people on your hearts? Because today you're very much involved in an organization called Vets of Hope, which is part of the Abundant Hope International with Susan Heggie, and I've had the pleasure of interviewing Susan on a couple of times. I just love the work that she's doing in really ministering to Holocaust survivors and just making a huge difference in the life of Holocaust survivors and in Israel generally and our hearts. So it's great that you're on board. But when did the Lord place that love for Israel and the Jewish people on your heart?
Well, in 2017, my mother died in Israel, where she lived in Netivot. She had fallen outside and went to the hospital in Beersheba and just never came back. She was there for about a week and died in the hospital. So I went on my first trip to Israel with 3 of my 4 sisters to bury our mother. She wanted to be buried in Israel and in a traditional way. And so we wanted to oversee that and close out her affairs and bring her stuff, if she had any things that she wanted back to the United States, or try to find her will, try to close out her bank accounts and her post office box, etc., in Ashkelon. So I started my trips to Israel, and that first trip was full of the sadness of burying my mother, but also learning and understanding the traditions of when a parent dies, and talking with rabbis about what is our next move, and how does the service go, just finding out some of those things about literally my roots as a German Jew, and things that my mother had experienced and wanted me to know about, because she loved the German people, the Israeli people, and she was a mother to so many. As a matter of fact, that's on her gravestone. She just was a mother, a kind woman who was a believer in Christ and learned how to speak Hebrew more, probably better than she knew how to speak English in the end, and just always looked for that opportunity to share the love of Yeshua with those people in and around her in Ashkelon. I felt a real draw to the Jewish people and the country of Israel in particular. Now, at that time, I had been employed after 9/11. I became an air marshal, United States Air Marshal, and I'm now retired from that. But so I was flying around the world. Got to London quite a bit, and I couldn't seem to get away from that schedule. I kind of became a little bit addicted to that lifestyle. I got deployed to Iraq in 2006, 2007, so I came back from that quite an angry man, and wanting to go back. That's all I really wanted to do, was continue to partake in the war on terror after 9/11. I kind of let that consume me. But I always loved Israel because my mother was there and she loved Israel.
Warren, if we just take ourselves back a few years, was Iraq the first kind of major war theater that you actually involved in? Was this really your first experience of armed conflict, being deployed to Iraq, particularly after the The war started in 2003 with the intention of removing Saddam Hussein from power.
Yes. Yes, I'd been an instructor quite a bit in my career, and I taught things from small weapons to unarmed unarmed tactics to military decision making and planning processes. You know, training military battalion and brigade staffs. Um, and in 2003, 2004, I was activated for 16 months, and I trained, you know, different soldiers and National Guard and Reserve how to do military police type duties around our airports and things like that. Then went back to doing the air marshal thing, and then got deployed to Iraq, and that was indeed my first deployment to a combat zone. And I was the operations sergeant major and served as the command sergeant major in that task force that was north of Baghdad. And so that was daunting, but I really felt like everything I had done up to that point, I'd been in the Army for about 20 years, and everything I'd done up to that point had trained me for that moment, for that time, job.
So, Warren, share with us what your experience was like being stationed just north of Baghdad, knowing that this is the time when we saw the huge rise of insurgencies against British and against American forces and other coalition forces based in Iraq, which was an extremely difficult time.
Yeah. When we got there in 2006, our TTPs, or our tactics, were a lot different than they became in 2007. So I was in OIF 2, OIF 3, excuse me, and this was the surge. The surge began a few months after I got there. So President Bush authorized just to flood the country and start taking back what the insurgents were taking from us. 2007 was probably the bloodiest month for American losses in Iraq. Our task force lost a soldier and a few others who were very seriously wounded. And the sacrifices I watched these soldiers go through on a daily basis, with no thought for their own lives, just eternally bonded my love for the military, both of the United States and of Great Britain, and anyone who would serve in the armed forces and fight for what is right. Just brings tears to my eyes every time I really think about it.
Absolutely. And we know that the Islamic Republic of Iran essentially turned Iraq into an insurgency. They used the model of the Lebanese civil war with the creation of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon to use those sort of terror tactics against British and American forces, the use of IED bombs, guerrilla warfare. And it's very difficult, isn't it, for a conventional army such as the US Army to actually then fight an insurgency war, whereby the terrorists that you are fighting don't follow the guidelines put out by the Geneva Convention. They use women and children as human shields, and effectively don't care about civilian lives, which makes it almost impossible to fight that kind of war. But, you know, as we know from Israel's experience, that Israel's been fighting this type of war for decades.
Yeah, they don't fight fair. And as soon as you figure out how they're fighting and adjust your tactics to address that, they change it up. So we'd employ different deterrents to going down the road in a convoy and hitting a roadside bomb. So we would employ different tactics to avoid that. And they would change it up. They came up with this with the help, I'm pretty sure, that with the help of Iran, they came up with different tactics, different weapons, huge explosives, 155 rounds buried, EFPs that could pierce armored plating vehicles and be more direct in their attack and more succinct in the casualties that they inflicted. Yeah, it was very unsure time But we took a more aggressive pose in 2007 because of the losses and because of the surge. We stopped merely occupying and started to control the country. That's right around the time General Petraeus came in, and we started all our counterinsurgency operations that worked. You know, we got village elders involved in the process. We started, you know, protecting the elections and letting Iraq start taking responsibility for Iraq. All the while, you know, putting our men and women in danger.
So we also saw that when President Obama came to power with the election of 2008, that one of his first policy decisions as president was effectively to withdraw all US troops from Iraq and effectively give complete control of Iraq to Maliki, who was nothing but a puppet of the Iranian regime. And then a few years later, we've seen the emergence of ISIS, a terror organization that we haven't seen that looks very, very similar to that of the Nazis, took over so much waves of Iraq, including Syria. And this is when we saw really the genocide against Assyrian Christians and Yazidis and other minorities as they wanted to establish the Islamic Caliphate. Do you think that that it was really President Obama's decision to completely withdraw US forces from Iraq that really led to the emergence of ISIS and Iraq becoming essentially an ISIS terror state, certainly in the north of the country?
It's a very interesting question. You know, I don't really know. I know the agenda of that type of thinking, or the democratic type of thinking at the time. And I think people wanted the war to end. I think President Obama wanted the people to be happy. I think he ruled that way. He was a president that would listen to polls quite a bit, and not necessarily do what was maybe the right thing to do for the situation at the time. You know, at the time, Simon, I was such an angry person. All I wanted to do, I had such a hatred of our enemy. And I dare say I had a hatred of Arabs. I wanted to do nothing but go back to combat and direct men in combat until we were victorious. And it did not feel victorious when I left Iraq. After taking the casualties that we took, I just wanted to go back and finish whatever. You know, it was just all in my head. And at the time, the next few years to me were just full of rage and me falling very deep into depression, losing my marriage, losing contact with my children. So I'll tell you, whatever motivated President Obama at the time, I was at a loss to care. And I was diving down my own rabbit hole of hatred and losing my faith daily. So I guess that's where my life got turned on its head, and I got a new direction.
Wow. Can you, before we talk about this new direction in your life, can you tell us the impact that 9/11 had on you? I think it shocked the world, and it would have shocked all Americans to see these aircraft flying into the Twin Towers, the aircraft flying into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., where really felt probably it's the first time really in American history that we see that the world superpower was attacked by a terrorist entity. Was it that decision that motivated you to become a U.S. federal marshal and then just protect American civilians and passengers by being an air marshal on one of these flights around the world?
Yeah, 9/11, of course, changed all of us, but I let it change me on a deeper level. That's where my hatred started. My mother was in Israel at the time, and my sisters were all begging her to come home because of the world situation. And she kind of laughed and was like, I got a tank down at the end of my street guarding my neighborhood. What do you have? And you want me to get on an airplane and fly to the United States right now? So we realized that she was very secure in Israel. Israel has always felt like a very secure place to me. 9/11 to me, I was currently working at the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and I thought I had found a career because I got off active duty in '93 and got a job at the Federal Bureau of Prisons and did 4 different prisons, activated some prisons, got involved in special ops, and went to all sorts of schools and stuff with them. And I really thought I found a home. I enjoyed working behind the fence. But 9/11 came, and I knew I had to do something more. I knew I had more to contribute, and I just felt this overwhelming urge to be right on the front lines of this. And the best thing I could think of right then was the U.S. Air Marshals program, which they were expanding. It just blew up. It blew up from 39 air marshals prior to 9/11 to over 4,500 within like 3 or 4 months. So I slipped through one of those cracks in the application process and got hired. And, it was the best job I'd ever been in. The job itself was actually horrible. You're pretending to be a passenger for long, long flights. It takes a toll on the body. But I worked with some of the most professional people that I would have never met otherwise. Some real special operators with real heads on their shoulders. We had our bad apples who got weeded out pretty quickly, and the program was very successful, I believe. It's still ongoing.
Excellent. Yeah, Warren, can I just talk through some of the military awards that you received during your very distinguished military career? I mean, you got the Bronze Star Medal for actions during Operation Iraqi Freedom. You've got the Meritorious Service Medal. You've got the Army Commendation Medal, 6 award, the Army Achievement Medal, 6 award. You have the Iraqi Campaign Ribbon with 2 bronze service stars. You also have the Army of Occupation Medal for Berlin, the Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, Presidential Unit Award, and Air Assault Badge. Now, that's some record, and that's some medals that you managed to achieve in your military career. As a Christian serving in the US military, what impact did that have on the way that you conducted your military term, and how you ended up relating to others, including the enemy?
Wow. Well, I mean, if I could do it again, I would have liked to be a more righteous leader. Even as a Christian, I feel like I was so absorbed in my own little battles that I like to think I was a pretty good soldier. And all the accolades and awards you just talked about, all that and 75 cents will get you a cup of coffee. But really, the award that I cherish the most on that uniform is the Berlin Occupation Medal, which is a World War II medal. Not a lot of soldiers right now in this era have that medal. And that's also where I met my best friend, Jason Noakes, who's my associate director here at Vets of Hope. And 30 years later, he comes back into my life, and now we're doing things together. How I conducted myself, being a Christian, I tried to conduct myself with integrity, of course, but that's one of the ethos of being a soldier. Having confidence, yet humility, selfless service, honor, duty. Really, these are creeds that you live by. And it was helpful for me, in the sense that I needed creeds. I was that type of personality that needed creeds, and I needed people around me that would speak into that lifestyle. And that was the military lifestyle. What I didn't realize was, on Sundays when I was reading God's word or trying to have quiet time, trying to raise a family in a godly way, was I needed that same type of fellowship. I needed that same type of intensity to grow in Christ. as I put in all that effort I put into being a good soldier and being promoted and being responsible for more and more pieces of the army as you get promoted. All that effort I put into that. What did I put into being a man of God? What did I put into being a father? What did I put into being a husband? And that's all I can compare my career to now. That God was very good to me, gracious to me throughout my career. And I'll always appreciate the United States Army, the Federal Air Marshal Service, and all the people I always worked with. But I look back and think, what if I put that kind of effort into my family? Would I be divorced? Would I be where I am? We can't look back and in regret and bemoan the past. But if I could change anything about my military career, it would be that I could be an effective, growing, maturing Christian and be surrounded by other maturing Christian men who could speak into my life. I didn't have a whole lot of mentorship, especially in that middle parts of my career.
But now I believe, Warren, the Lord is really using you to touch his people, particularly veterans that have served in the IDF. So that leads me on to my next very important question. How did Vets of Hope come about, and how did your encounter with Susan Heggie of Abundant Hope International kind of bring you really into the forefront of Israel ministries?
Meeting Susan. Okay, so I often went overseas in my duties as an air marshal, and I was on my way to a undisclosed location in Europe, and I was in the United States, and it was just another day, and we rotate around where we sit in the aircraft. This day I was in the way back, and it's not the preferred seat because you got to sit with all the crowded in people. And, I had an 8-hour flight ahead of me, and I wasn't really looking forward to it. I don't know what was going on that day. But it was in, I believe, in the end of 2017, or the spring of 2017, because I had just come back from Israel, and I was going back there in a few months with my brother-in-law, because we couldn't finish out all the things we had to do to finalize my mother's accounts and things. So I had to go back. Anyway, I'm waiting on this flight. This flight's boarding. Here comes this lady, and she's giving me that look, and I'm just trying to look at my paper, like I'm sitting in the aisle seat. I know she's going to want to sit on the window seat, and I'm thinking I got 8 hours. I got to sit with this lady. So I get up. She says, "Yes, I'm sitting there." And I get up and I don't say anything. I got my earbuds in, like I'm listening to music, like when you don't want to talk to people on aircraft. And I just nod to her, and she sits down, and she's got Tim Tebow's book, Shaken. And she's reading that. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, she's a Christian. Now I got to talk to her. So, I literally had that kind of attitude. It was such a bad attitude. I repented since. But as soon as we met, I said, "Do you know Yeshua?" was my question to her. And she looked at me like, "How do you know Yeshua? How do you know his name is Yeshua?" And it just opened up about my connection with Israel and her connection with Israel. And then she was the president of Abundant Hope International that took care of Holocaust survivors in Israel. And so she invited me to their guest house in Akko, Israel, and invited us to stay, my brother-in-law and myself, in a couple of months. I mean, literally in 8 hours, by the time we landed in the city in Europe, we had prayed together twice, had held hands and prayed together twice. And just the Spirit of God was just mingling between us. I don't think we stopped for a breath or other than to eat that, single serving food they give you back there on the aircraft. We prayed for that together. We were just like tight souls. We just connected. So I did go and stay with her a few months later. We made all the arrangements, and I met my first Holocaust survivors in the spring of 2017. past. And that was a life-changing event in itself.
Amazing. So can you share with us what Vets for Hope? What is what do you do in terms of your organisation of really standing with former Israeli soldiers that may have suffered from PhD and other things, and post-traumatic stress, and kind of weariness of being involved in so many of Israel's wars, including terror wars, and how do you really unite them with serving or former serving US servicemen like yourself with their Israeli counterparts?
Yeah, this is in development. And my first trip there, I had made contact with Shai, who runs an organization called Leave No Soldier in the Field. And that's down in southern Israel. And he ministers in his way to bring light and forgiveness, in a sense, to IDF soldiers who suffer post-traumatic symptoms. And I didn't get to meet him my first time there, but the second time I had brought veterans with me, I did get to meet him, and we started to mingle with IDF veterans who suffer. And yeah, Israel is under threat every day. You live in Israel, you live under a threat. And the incursions in Gaza and Lebanon, or the conflicts there on those borders, some soldiers come away and there's some things in life you're not supposed to see as a human being, and you can't unsee things. And so that causes trauma. And, my first time meeting with a Holocaust survivor, which I just thought would be a neat thing to do. I didn't think of it as a ministry. I thought, well, I'll have a place to stay. I can get to know more about Israel because Susan offered to show us around while we were there. And, but when I first met a Holocaust survivor, Sephora, my brother-in-law and I were there. She was holding my brother-in-law's hand and had mentioned that that's the first hand of a man that she'd held in so many years since her husband had passed on. And I got this stupid tattoo on my forearm that I got after I got back from Iraq. And she kind of motioned to my tattoo as if to say, because she was showing hers on her wrist. And she kind of smiled and motioned to my tattoo as if to say, you know what a tattoo feels like to get one. And my soul broke. I just broke down, because that was American pride and ego and rebellion, putting this tattoo on my forearm voluntarily to be rebellious or cool or something. And she had that tattoo put on. She couldn't understand why they were doing it. It was forced on her. They weren't gentle and they weren't hygienic. And that tattoo and those numbers remind her every day of what she went through. So that started to work on my soul in a very meaningful way. I had been back from Iraq, of course, for quite a while, but I was still floundering. I don't know how I kept my job as an air marshal. I was such an angry person. All I wanted to do was train and train and train and try to get back to one of the theaters. Afghanistan was my next stop. God saw fit to blow out my bicep. Ooh. So while I was working out, I blew out my left bicep. So I couldn't go on any more deployments until that healed. And that was 1.5 years of healing. Ended up going back to Israel with a couple of veterans. And that's really where the idea started. Because, Susan runs her nonprofit over there, Abundant Hope International, all by herself over there in Israel. And she's not even Israeli. She's a legal resident. And she doesn't have any Jewish ancestry. She just has a love for the Jewish people and a heart for the Holocaust survivors. But she looked at me one evening and said, I could use a sergeant major over here. And she was kind of joking, and we all laughed. And my brother-in-law kind of gave me that look like, I think she wants you to be involved. And I was thinking, yeah, okay, I'll come back. But it sort of grew into this idea of Vets of Hope from Abundant Hope International, because I really was so impacted by my visit there. Again, and I'm sorry for rambling on, but this is such a complex thing that happened to me. You were back in the Middle East. Okay, so my trip to Israel was like being back it was being in the Middle East. Now nobody was trying to kill me, and I didn't have to wear body armor, but you could hear the calls to prayer 5 times a day. You could smell the smells of the Mediterranean food, and you could smell the smells of the desert if you were down in the south of Israel, where we hung out a lot. And 120 degrees, and I'm getting a tour from an IDF veteran of the Gaza border with Egypt and Gaza. I'm getting a tour right on the lines. I'm going by tanks and ammo vehicles that are ready to go into Gaza if needed. They are running with guys standing behind guns. And I'm smelling these things. I'm going down this dirt road, and I just had this, wasn't a flashback, but your heart rate starts increasing. And this is what PTSD is. It's a normal reaction to trauma. And my palms start sweating, and I get hyper vigilant. But that time, my buddies were there. They were in the back seat. And I just gave them a look. And Shai was driving, the Israeli veteran. And he was explaining what was happening, where we were. And I was talking to him about, what he does with other veterans. But I got pretty quiet. I looked back, and I guess the look I gave my buddies, they knew. And they kind of were having that feeling too. But we kind of, fist bumped, brought each other back to center, and like, man, you aren't there. You aren't there. You're with us. You're here and now, and you're safe. And that brought me right back. And, I haven't had that kind of a feeling in quite a while since that experience. Just confronting a hatred of people, that I was able to meet Christian Arabs this time. So David Wilkerson, that comes back around in my life. David Wilkerson planted a church in Mount Carmel, and we ended up going to this church at Mount Carmel. And there's so many different influences in that trip to Israel. I started meeting Arab. They had Arab and Russian and Polish and Jewish and all sorts of nationalities. I mean, when they were singing their hymns, there was like 5 different translations. I mean, it took me forever to get through the translations, trying to learn Hebrew. I just ended up just humming along the song. But there were so many different nationalities in this congregation that were worshiping Yeshua on the top of Mount Carmel. And God was just putting Arabs in front of me and hugging me and praying with me and sharing with me. And I just realized my heart started to melt for Arabs, for the enemies that would fight against us. Not that I wouldn't fight them again, but that hatred was gone. That hatred was gone. That kind of healing starts trickling through your life, and the Holy Spirit of God will start to move in your life in a new and powerful way once you start repenting of your hatred and your sin that I had personally let in during 9/11. And so it had been 2 decades, and it was just such a relief. And I just wanted to share that with other veterans. And being a first responder, first responders go through even more, because as veterans get deployed to a war zone, they come back and they can rest and recuperate and call it a day, and pin the ribbons on your uniform and talk about those things and process through some of them. First responders, whether you be a firefighter or a police officer, ambulance driver or ER nurse, you do that every day. And a lot of those people don't have a way of deprogramming at the end of the day. So I knew I had to do something a little more significant and reach out to that community and try to bring them that kind of healing that I felt going back to the Middle East. That was just a really neat thing. And meeting a Holocaust survivor, And I know I'm rambling, but there's something that happens between a Holocaust survivor. They have a resiliency that I can't explain. I can't put my finger on it.
And an optimism.
And a lot of optimism.
And I've interviewed quite a few Holocaust survivors for the Middle East Report. One thing, 9 times out of 10, there's a certain characteristic they all have. And this is an incredible joy and incredible passion for life. And there is no hatred in their hearts. And if anyone you think is actually justified to have hatred against the Germans or the Nazis, they have, but they don't have any of it. And that's what extraordinary. So, Warren, we're down to the last 5 minutes of the program, but how important is it, for example, that through Vets for Hope that you are able to connect former serving members of the IDF with those that served in the US Armed Forces to come together so that they really feel the love of Yeshua from for example, former US officers like yourself, and the impact that has on Israelis, knowing that they're not alone.
Yeah, that's going to be, there's not a price tag on that kind of experience, especially with the love of Yeshua in our hearts. So with that question, enter COVID and enter the restrictions that we are now in. It's very important to now circle our wagons and develop a way forward to interconnect some agencies and people that have the knowledge and the ability to make these connections happen in the future. What I've done is saved up my own money, my first trip with 2 veterans from Florida. And we went and we had a fantastic 7 days in the Holy Land and met many Holocaust survivors and actually trained with some IDF. We probably won't do that in the future, but it does, and it was. And a little plug for Caliber 3. Thanks, guys, in Bethlehem. Anyway, we're developing our next trip, which was supposed to be last fall. And that's just been cut off from us. But what I see in the meantime in our ministry and what has developed out of our ministry is connection with other platforms, service platforms that are helping veterans and first responders to heal in a spiritual way, in a mental and emotional and physical way. So we're connecting with these other platforms. Vets of Hope in Vermont has actually 28 members here. And it's a ministry to men, and I'm trying to expand it to ministry to female veterans as well, because there's no reason we should be doing this only for male veterans. But my ministry is to men, and there is a difference in the way men and women heal. So we got involved with Chad Robichaud and the Mighty Oaks program, Mighty Oaks Foundation. Their motto is "You never fight alone," and I actually went through their program, and 2 of my members of Vets of Hope also went through their program and are considered alumni. Now, the part of their the program's a week long, and it's free to veterans who have a DD 214, and you go out to a resort somewhere in the country and you unpack life. And so we are now a Mighty Oaks outpost, the only one in New England. And we do follow-up care, which is peer-to-peer. And we're not AA, we're not NA. We're peer-to-peer, faith-based, and we do study programs like Every Man a Warrior or Reboot. We're in the middle of Every Man a Warrior right now, Lonnie Berger's Bible study for men. And we're watching lives be transformed. And we want to share that. We want to share that stuff on a global level now. As we step into the possibility of maybe getting back to Israel this coming fall. But so we're trying to raise funds like that. We're selling some T-shirts. I tap some maple trees up here in Vermont with the family, and we're trying to do some maple sugar maybe ideas for Vets of Hope fundraising. Trying to get some scholarships up to help us with the costs of flying veterans over who can't afford to fly over themselves. Like I said in the past, I've saved up my money, and the guys will do their own fundraising and saving. And we just do it ourselves. But I think this has got the possibilities of going bigger. And I really want to share, I really got a heart to share this experience with veterans and first responders.
Amen. Warren, I just thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report. And thank you for sharing your incredible testimony. And I think with you that the best is yet to come, and that the Lord, his heart is really to show the love of Yeshua to his people, the people of Israel, the Israelis, and particularly those Israelis who have served and defended the state of Israel. And so I want to thank you so much for joining me on today's program. And I pray that the Lord would just really expand this new ministry for Vets for Hope. And thank you for sharing with us your very powerful story.
Can I say one more thing, Simon? That the Lord shall renew the years the locusts have eaten. The Lord will renew the years and restore the years that have been stolen from you, veterans and first responders. Because I threw away and lost everything. And now the Lord's given me a new wife, a new life, a new start, a new ministry, and a new heart, more importantly. So if what you're doing is not working to get better or get through this hatred, try something different. Open your Bible and start to pray.
I want to thank our viewers for watching this program today. I mean, we've heard the incredible story of Sergeant Major retired Warren Lyon. Really share how the Lord's been with him and impacting his life, particularly his very distinguished military career and what he's doing now in serving the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. And it's important that we keep Israel and the Jewish people on our prayers, and also to stand up for them at this time of rising Jew hatred, the time when we're seeing the emergence of Iran very close to developing nuclear weapons. Again, Israel finding herself almost alone on the world stage. It's important that we pray that the Jewish people would recognize their God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is protecting them and is with them. So thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.